Well, hello out there and welcome to the University of Idaho Beef Webinar Series. Today's installment is going to focus on the end product more so than the production component. Joining us today is Dr. Phil Bass, who is one of the meat specialists up on the University of Idaho campus. I'm going to go ahead and let Phil take off with his introduction and get going on the tasty end products that we get out of our beef cattle. Thanks, Phil, for joining us.
Well, thank you, Miranda, and it's always a pleasure and honor to be a part of these series and get a chance to share my understanding and ideas on what's going on out in the market, how that relates to product quality, how product quality relates to the end market experience. And so for a few folks that were in attendance at the Idaho Cattle Association meeting, well, this will be a little bit of a review. For the remainder, hopefully this will be kind of a little bit of a recap of 30,000-foot view of what's going on in the market based off of my observations and what to expect possibly in the future, and how are we doing? What's the barometer reading of the beef market in general? I feel optimistic, honestly. And so with that, we're looking at some rather unusual times right now. You can kind of see back in May when we just really saw a tank of the value of fed steers in the marketplace in the United States. And we'll talk about why really here in just a minute. But a lot of it's really having to do with the COVID situation across the world, really impacting agriculture here in the United States in the sense that we're having to recalibrate and look at different ways of making sure that our workforce is protected, that the food is still safe going out, which I still wholeheartedly believe that we still have the safest food supply in the world. But we're dealing with some things out there that are causing some ripples in the industry in general. So unusual times indeed. That's my beautiful wife, Tina, right there, braving a trip to Costco with her protective equipment there. And definitely unusual times for all in that regard. But have we experienced unusual times in the past? I believe we have. And really, so overall, adversity leads to advancement. That's kind of the way that I'm trying to look at this. I'm a bit of a history nerd. I like to go back and see how and why we are the way that we are in a microscopic sense and then in a very much macro sense. But there have been things in the past that the meat business and the beef business especially has encountered that at first may have looked like, gosh, this is the end of the world. There's no way we're going to recover from something like this. And it turns out we actually had some pretty cool advancements come from those times, looking back, hindsight being 2020 that it is. If we look at all the way back to 1906, the book The Jungle was published. It was anybody that has read The Jungle will know that it was kind of an expose on the Eastern European folks moving to the United States and some of the tough times they were having to encounter as far as employment and having to figure out life in general, especially in a country that didn't speak their languages. And a small portion of The Jungle, even though a lot is attributed to this small portion, is their time spent in the packing houses. The packing houses in the Union Stockyards of Chicago. And it was a bit of an expose that talked about how there were not only employee safety issues, but maybe overall food safety issues. Well, some folks in government started getting drawn into this discussion at that time. And in fact, Teddy Roosevelt was brought into the discussion, who was the president at the time. And really The Jungle, a lot of people attribute this movement, this expose, as the development of our current food safety system in the United States. We won't teach a meat science class, an introductory meat science class, without mentioning this particular book. Now, the thing about that book is that if I were, I'm Philip Bass, but Philip Armour or Gustavus Swift at the time. These were some of the biggest meat magnates of our era of the late 19th, early 20th century. These guys would have considered this book almost an act of terrorism to the business. But it turns out that it has led to the safest food supply in the world. And it kind of was a almost just that instant rip off the Band-Aid situation that actually led to a lot of good later on. So take it as you will. If you want to read The Jungle, I would encourage folks so they can kind of get that background and experience. If you look up at the top left-hand corner, you can see some of the U.S. doughboys in the trenches of World War I. Now, that was an absolutely tragic situation, a terrible, terrible event across the world. And how does that relate to the meat business? Well, turns out that situation brought to the attention of the U.S. government that we didn't have a good way of identifying consistent, high quality meat products to get to our government institutions, and especially to our armed forces at that time. And so this was the lead up to what we now have as our USDA grading system. So the terms prime, choice, and select, even though they were a long ways separated from 1917, 1918, but those would never have existed if it weren't for these tough times that we had and the need to look at the inconsistencies in our food distribution system, leading to more of a consistent way of identifying product, merchandising product, et cetera. So World War I, in fact, was a bit of the inception point of our current USDA grading system. It's kind of cool. If we fast forward a few years into the early 1990s, you can see, especially here in the Pacific Northwest, this was a big deal, the Jack in the Box incident. So for those of you who are unfamiliar with this is when E. coli 0157H7 was first really discovered, brought to our attention, and identified as a pathogen of concern in the beef world especially. Before this, we really didn't have a lot of additional food safety regulations. We had a food safety system. We had the inspection service in place. We had we did have USDA oversight as far as food safety was concerned, but we didn't have quite as much buy-in by the industry itself. And this actually led to this tragic event, in fact, where people did perish because of E. coli 0157H7 in beef, in undercooked beef. This actually led to what is now a ubiquitous system across all of the meat world and pretty much all food world, and that's the HACCP system, Hazard Analysis Critical Control Points. This was kind of that just kicking off point that just said, guys, it's really time we start to focus on this and make sure that we are preventing, eliminating, and reducing hazards. That's the objectives of the HACCP system. A few more years later, we had the cow that stole Christmas, again up here in the Pacific Northwest, where bovine spongiform encephalopathy was identified for the first time in the United States. That has also helped to lead to a more rigorous food safety system with additional redundancies, but important redundancies, and an overwhelming abundance of caution to make sure that, again, we have the safest food supply in the world. And then kind of a more recent event that I attribute a lot of really good to was the tragic times from about 2009 up until early 2013, when we had a severe drought in the center states, in the middle states in the United States. This led to a lot of pain in the beef industry for those major producers in that Central Plains section. They just didn't have feed. They couldn't keep the cows, couldn't keep the old cows especially. And as a result, there was huge herd liquidations. Well, what happens when you have to liquidate a herd is you don't get rid of the youngest, newest genetics you have. You start teasing out the old ones and really culling those older genetics. Well, as a result, we were left with a much smaller herd, a smaller beef population in the United States, but they were a lot newer genetics. And then as soon as the rain started coming again in the Central Plains, we had a lot more feed abundance, and we could start rebuilding and repopulating our beef herd supply. Well, you don't go and find really old genetics when you're repopulating your herd. You bring in the newest, coolest stuff. And so as a result, we have some amazingly efficient beef cattle across the United States. And also we're seeing some amazing grade outs that's happening. I'll end the discussion at the very end of this webinar, kind of showing you that I think we've come a long way as far as meeting the goal of supplying the consumer with what they want. Okay, so we have seen adversity. This is nothing new. And if we can just keep powering through, continue to be leaders in the agricultural community, we will likely see advancements and good things hopefully come from this. But how about the current situation? How about what we're dealing with right now? Well, just a few months ago, the virus made its way into the packing house systems. Anybody that's ever been to a large-scale packing facility will realize this is a manufacturing type setting, and a lot of skilled hands-on labor that's in those environments. But because you're bringing upwards of 1,000 people sometimes to work in one location, there's likely there's the high likelihood of, if there's some type of disease, is going to spread pretty rapidly. And so as a result, we had a number of plants go down offline for a couple weeks in some cases, trying to figure out how do we continue to produce the meat that we need, but also in a very safe environment that is welcoming for the employees to want to come to work. Because we can open the plants, but if nobody is willing to come, if they don't feel safe and they don't feel like they're being taken care of, they're not going to show up. And so there were plants that went down, there were plants that went offline, but we also had an enormous supply of cattle out there. And so as a result, we had this kind of bottleneck happen in the industry. At the same time, there's been a huge pull-through demand for beef, especially meat in general, but beef especially. People want beef. They're not going out to a steakhouse necessarily and buying beef, enjoying beef out there, but they are enjoying it at home. And in fact, over the Father's Day weekend, my goodness, the United States really stepped up and really is supporting the beef industry, to say it in a very subtle way. There's a lot of demand for meat out there. Okay. And some additional really good news for our cattle producers that are on the line and listening is that cattle slaughter is back up to just about normal. Now, that doesn't mean that we have overcome the backlog of fat cattle that are out there, and especially all the other animals that are now starting to go into backgrounding and stocking and all that stuff. Thankfully, the beef industry and the segmentations of the beef industry allows for these animals to go out onto pasture, and so kind of act as that shock absorber really going forward. And so again, I'm very positive. I have a very positive outlook on this. We're dealing with some very unusual times, but I would say there's not a lot of people more resourceful than guys that operate and maintain packing houses. And they're going to figure this out. They're going to figure out ways of making sure that the employees are safe, number one, getting those cattle pushed through, and then also getting that high quality product out to the folks that are really demanding it right now. Okay. There's been a lot of discussion, and in fact, I was having a lot of discussions with producers out there in that late April, early May time, when we were just continuing to see that market value of fed steers tanking, the value of beef cattle just really having a hard time, really struggling. Folks saying, "Well, I think I'm going to go out and start my own packing plant." And I would tell them, you know what? I will help you. I will advise you if that is indeed the direction you would like to go. However, I would caution folks doing that, because the prices that we were seeing, and especially what folks would say is the disparity between what was being sold out in the retail segments, out in the retail market, and what the cattle producers were receiving, that was not sustainable. Okay, there's no way that that price disparity could have happened. I'll show you the next graph here. Not normal. Okay, here's the cutout of beef carcasses in that late April, early May, transitioning into June. And guys, this is a whole spike that the market analysts out there would just want to completely just erase from their spreadsheets, because it's not normal. It's not predicted. It's not good even for predictability of marketing animals. This was a spike because there is a bit of a bottlenecking choke point at the packing level. But I'll tell you, that packing level has really stepped up, getting those cattle moving through there again, and getting the employees back to work and moving the product again. And I do know a number of these large-scale packing facilities are running every bit of 6 days a week, just trying to keep up, trying to move those animals through there. And in fact, I'll tell you what, anybody that was really skeptical of the packers, talking to some in particular general managers of these plants, guys, they literally were, they felt the pain, and they were literally saying, we're trying to do the right thing. And the reality is there's an overabundance of cattle out there. Guys were trying to just cut losses and send animals wherever and whenever they could. And there was the price disparity at the retail side, where people were seeing this cutout that you see in front of you. And they were seeing the high prices of steaks and especially ground beef in the supermarket. They're saying, why isn't this money trickling back? Oversupply on this side, over amount of demand on the other side of the packing house, and really just leading to a very unusual market dynamic that hopefully we'll be able to resolve in the future if we ever run into any situations like this again. And I like to always bring to the point of just about it doesn't matter the product. Who sets the price? And if we were in an open forum, I would sit and pause and allow for you guys to answer that, but I'll answer that for you in the rhetorical sense. It's the customer. The customer sets the price. And there was so much pull-through demand on the other side of the packing business in that late April, early May time. People were just, the retailers were willing to pay it because they could sell it on the other end, because people were willing to pay the difference. And an overabundance of supply on the cattle side, and guys selling cattle at a much lower value than otherwise would have preferred, just to get them run through the system and cut losses. And so weird dynamics, not normal, not usual. Don't go out and start a packing house unless you already have one going. And then in that case, I'll give you a hand trying to get it up and running. But these are very unusual times. And like I said, the market analysts even want to just go and completely eliminate all this data out of their spreadsheets, because it's not something that ever could have really been predicted, and not something that we would likely see again this dramatically in the future. Okay. So that's the general value situation of the industry and the unusual situations that we're dealing with. Well, what is that going to be doing to the beef cattle in general out there? Well, guys, we got big animals. That's the short of it. We had these animals that were on feed. They continued to maintain them on feed. The number of cattle on feed continues to be backed off as we're going into the grazing seasons, and allowing some of those animals to go out and go on to backgrounding situations. However, that also will lead to big animals. There's just this huge wave that we're going to have to overcome. Okay, and that's just the reality of it. Big animals, big beef, which kind of bodes well for some of the research we're doing here at the University of Idaho. We've been focusing on how do these bigger carcasses affect the ultimate meat that's going to be displayed in the retail and also in sold at food service. And so thankfully, we're already kind of ramped up and looking at that those dynamics and how is that being affected. But we're going to have big animals for a while now. Okay. Just the reality of things. And what does that mean as far as the value of the animal? Well, anyone can look this up. It's NW_LS410. It's up there in the top left-hand corner. This is the weekly market news update of the beef carcass value. And this is something that my team, our research team, looks at regularly, looking at the value of quality in general, but then also the size of carcasses and fatness of carcasses, because that is going to ultimately dictate the overall value of a carcass. And if you look at the very bottom of this chart, these are pooled numbers from across the United States, from across the packing industry in the United States, and looking at the value of carcasses within these particular categories. You can see a simplified grid system right there. And even though it looks a bit complicated, I can kind of break this down a little bit for you, but you can see across the top axis, you have the carcass weights. Again, this is down at the very bottom of that chart, but you have the carcass weight ranges, and then you have some quality and yield parameters on the left-hand side, and that's a basics of a grid-based value system, and these are the dollars per hundredweight for carcasses that fall within those particular categories. Something we look at with our team quite regularly is on that far right-hand side, and the discounts that from a baseline choice yield grade 3, a baseline value, the discounts that will be applied to a carcass once they're over 900 pounds and over 1,000 pounds. Okay. And then there's more discounts as you go over 1,000 pounds, 1,050. I mean, the discount ranges can increase depending on the particular animal. Now, these discounts are actually lower than what they were a year ago. And I believe that has a lot to do with just the fact that there's so much pull-through demand on beef. But it's still a sign that the packing industry and the industry in general puts less value on really big animals. And again, that's some of the things we're trying to understand with our research team. But then beyond that, this the signal that the merchandising segments and the packing industry is trying to just say, you know, we value certain parameters, but really big cattle is not one of them, unfortunately. And so hopefully we continue with that really strong pull-through demand. I believe we will, which will minimize the discount effect on carcass values. But how about we focus more on what it is that the producer or the consumers do want, which is some of the things on the left-hand side of the screen right there. And so that's when you get into, say, Prime or some of your certified beef products. So you up here in the Pacific Northwest, we have our RR signature. That's a certified USDA certified program, certified Angus beef, of course, across most of the U.S. packing base, sterling silver and cargo plants, Chairman's Reserve, Swift 1855, these certified by the USDA branded beef programs will give premiums over that baseline price. And so you can see you get into the prime value, you can get upwards of $11 a hundredweight additional value on your baseline choice price. If you certify, you get upwards of $5 a hundredweight, and that's pretty consistent within those branded beef programs. What are some of the big driving factors, of course, for those positives, for those premium values? Well, guys, if anybody has sat through any presentation of Phil Bass, I'm sure you've seen me talk and preach pretty hard about marbling. Marbling is going to be our big driving factor as far as flavor, tenderness, juiciness, palatability, as we call it in the meat sciences. That's the thing that's going to keep bringing the consumers back. That's what they want. They want an experience, and they want it to taste good. It's a good tasting experience. And that's something that the U.S. beef supply is very good at, in fact. It's one of the reasons why we're leaders across the globe when it comes to beef demand. It's not that we have the cheapest beef. It's not that our beef is cheap to get into other countries. It's because people like it because we're good at putting that marbling in there. So what is marbling? If you're not familiar with it, it's the intramuscular flecks of fat, the little tiny white flecks in that ribeye right there, and other cuts. And as I like to say, it's a little flecks of flavor that the flavor fairies sprinkle into the meat prior to us harvesting that animal. That's not exactly how it goes. If there's any physiologists living or not living, but listening, but over time, over that animal's lifespan, we're able to increase their marbling if they have the marbling potential, of course. And that's where a lot of genetic baseline comes from. The animal has to be predisposed to marbling. There's definitely certain breeds out there that are more predisposed to marbling than others. And then we also have to manage them. So it's nature and nurture, as we like to say. Okay. So marbling leads to that overall eating experience. Okay. Flavor, tenderness, and juiciness, what I've already mentioned, which is palatability. That's what we measure in the meat sciences. And that is kind of like a three-legged stool, because you can't just have really good flavor but terrible tenderness and a really dry steak. It's not going to work. You have to have all three of those working in unison. Tenderness is a big one that we look at a lot, and I'll talk about how marbling influences tenderness here in just a little bit. Flavor has become a big one that has become a big focus. Juiciness can be very dependent on the individual muscle. However, that's also dependent on the amount of marbling those muscles are more predisposed to being deposited. So it is that three-legged stool. It needs to have the great flavor that you're expecting. It has to have the tenderness that's going to be that initial bite before you notice anything else. And then it has to have that sustained juiciness. Because if beef is really, really dry, that is going to be rather off-putting as well. Okay, so what we found is as you increase marbling in beef cattle, you also increase the palatability experience. All right, so I'll share some of that information here just briefly with the group. All right. How do we get to marbling? However, it's evaluated by the USDA, the USDA Agricultural Marketing Service Division. So it's not the inspectors, it's the graders that make these assessments. You can see on that in that image, it's an evaluation at the 12th and 13th rib separation on these beef carcasses. The ribeye is exposed to oxygen, allowing for the bloom to occur, that reddening of the muscle, and then the grader can evaluate for the marbling and maturity, but we're going to focus more on marbling today, okay? Our different levels of marbling that are going to be evaluated, you can see on the screen, goes all the way from slight and actually less than that, but really these are the grades that we're going to talk about the most of in the U.S. packing base. But we have slight all the way up to moderately abundant. The three main grades we discuss in the USDA grading system for beef is prime, choice, and select. Okay. Prime, the minimum amount of marbling for prime is the slightly abundant. So the bottom middle image that you see right there, minimum amount of marbling for USDA prime. So you can see quite a bit of marbling in that ribeye at that 12th and 13th rib separation. For the minimum amount of marbling for USDA choice, you have the small category. So directly above that in the middle top image. That's the minimum amount of marbling for USDA choice, and kind of the baseline for our pricing system in the grid-based, formula-based, value-based pricing system that I would say the overwhelming majority of cattle are sold on now into the packing community. If you talk about like the upper 2/3 of the choice grade, which is a little bit of a misnomer, but still it's the upper 2 tiers of the choice grade, modest and moderate. And that's where a lot of our premium-based branded beef programs are going to fall. Again, the largest, most popular one, certified Angus beef. Then you have, of course, Sterling Silver, Swift 1855, Chairman's Reserve. And then if you look at the Double R signature branded beef program that's unique to the AgriBeef or the Washington beef operation, that's going to be the top 1/3 category. And so that's going to be moderate and higher. But again, as you incrementally increase in that amount of marbling, you increase the potential for palatability. And then, of course, the very minimum amount of marbling for USDA Select is the slight category, so the top left-hand image that you see right there. Anything less than that in marbling is considered ungraded beef, what we also term as no roll, but that's a whole nother discussion for a whole nother time, okay? And really, this is in the young beef category. We're not really getting into the old beef. That's maybe for another discussion as well. As you incrementally increase in marbling, however, it's that insurance policy that you're buying, that the consumer is buying to expect a higher quality eating experience. That's what they're looking at. Okay. And finally, we actually published that in a journal in Meat Science. Colin Corbin out of Texas Tech University finally just laid it out on the line. And so us scientists can now say it with confidence. Increased marbling level has a positive effect on beef palatability. And so it continues to be kind of almost that driving factor for consumers to continue to have that pull through demand for beef. That's a good thing. We want them to be pulling it through. We don't want to just say, here's a bunch of stuff we have. I hope you like it. What we have is that we have consumers out there that are aware of high quality beef that we're able to produce in the United States and across the globe. Now the end users are aware and they're pulling it through. They're pulling the demand through, and that's a good thing. Okay. So how does marbling overall affect the palatability? Well, let's talk about this real quick. Marbling improves tenderness by reducing the bulk density of each bite. I'll explain that. It provides a lubricating property. When you're biting through meat, you're actually creating a mechanical friction. And when you create friction, if you can have something to ease the friction, like a juiciness factor or a fat or a grease, you can get that perception of a more tender bite by having that marbling in there as it cooks and melts and becomes kind of more of that oil. And then you have the providing insurance against overcooking. Now, what that means is that it's an insulating factor. It gradually allows for heat to traverse through that steak or roast. It's not a very quick exchange of heat. And by preventing overcooking, you can enhance tenderness, because we also know that as you get closer and closer to the well done category, you're likely going to have a less tender bite. Back to the very first point, though, what does reducing bulk density of each bite? Well, what does that mean? Well, if you look kind of down in the bottom left-hand corner of that image, you can kind of see the examples of bulk density. And marbling, it's fat. Well, fat is less dense than the muscle that's surrounding it, okay? If it's less dense, it's going to be easier to bite through. And so that's kind of what we're looking at here. That fat, it's not as dense as the muscle that's around it. If you incorporate some of that fat, interweave that fat into the bite itself, it's going to be easier to bite through. And so marbling definitely leads to tenderness. As marbling improves, so does tenderness. This continues to be observed. Okay. But it's more than just tenderness. How about juiciness? Okay, tenderness, juiciness. As marbling increases, so does the juiciness factor. And so here's a great stair-step effect that was observed. As marbling increased, so does juiciness, based off of trained sensory panel evaluations from Colorado State University. Mallory Emerson published this research a few years ago. It definitely prevents the meat from drying out. Okay, as you're cooking a steak, you're evaporating moisture, you're evaporating water out of there. And that's kind of the reason why that steak starts to turn that brownish color, is eventually you get the water away. You're able to now, because water is a cooling entity. Okay. And as you're putting heat to that, the water is quickly absorbing that heat, but eventually it gets so much heat, it starts to go and turn to steam. And that's why you see the steam coming off of just about any meat item that you're cooking, whether you're grilling or roasting or anything, you're going to have that water evaporation. Well, if the water is evaporating and now you cut into that steak because you've evaporated that water, you're going to have a lot less juiciness, unless you have marbling. Because marbling, that's already kind of interwoven within all those muscle bundles, that marbling stays there. When you cook that steak, that marbling kind of melts, and so it does kind of create that more liquid factor, but it doesn't just seep out of the meat. It stays in there. And so until you cut into it and bite into it, and that's where you'll get that experience of juiciness as a result of marbling. Okay. So marbling is great for juiciness. Interesting also is that it's kind of a primitive response to a physiological primitive response to us. When we bite into something that has marbling, it will actually stimulate our salivary glands. Marbling, is energy dense. It tastes really good too, and it has a lot of monounsaturated fatty acids in it, which are actually the really good fats. And so all of that being said, having that marbling in your diet, if we go way back into our caveman times, if you could get that fat in your diet, you were more likely to survive. Well, we still have this response in our brain and our physiological response on our taste buds. And so when you taste that fat, it actually will stimulate the salivary glands. It stimulates that appetite almost. But having that stimulation of salivary glands is going to incorporate more water, more moisture into that bite as you're chewing it, and so it just adds to that much more juiciness. So a lot of things that marbling can contribute as far as juiciness, and then of course flavor. Oh my gosh, marbling is going to contain the fats in general, with regardless of the species. Fats contain the species-specific carbonyl compounds that make meat taste like the species it's coming from. Makes beef taste like beef, makes lamb taste like lamb, makes pork taste like pork. And as you increase in the amounts of that fat that contains the species-specific compounds in it, you're going to get more of those flavors in there. It's going to be more noticeable. Okay, and so a really low marbled steak, although it will still taste like beef, won't have the beefiness to it. It won't have that more robust flavor that is expected, that beefiness flavor that is expected compared to a higher marbled steak. Okay, and so as marbling increases, so does flavor acceptability and palatability. And so hopefully I've explained how marbling is important. But are we meeting our goals? Is there any evidence out there that we're meeting our goals as far as an industry across the board? Are we getting to the consumer what they are expecting? I share this chart a lot. I think it's very, very telling of how we are achieving our goals. Since 1991, the National Beef Quality Audit has been conducted, and approximately every 5 years, and that sends out academics into the packing base, and the grades are evaluated. There's many things that are evaluated during the National Beef Quality Audit, but the grades are evaluated, and in fact, the individual marbling categories can be evaluated as well. Well, 1991, that was the first year. The marbling categories aren't nearly as relevant as what we're looking at right now. Okay, so starting from 1995 all the way up to the current year, I have the USDA numbers. I don't have the marbling categories broken down individually because USDA doesn't report individual marbling categories, but it does report the grades, prime, choice, and select. I would say we are definitely starting to meet whatever the goal may have been, or at least we're going in that direction. Okay. The consumer has said the beef was too lean in the 90s. There's no question about it. Even though that's what they said they wanted in the 90s, beef production continued, or beef consumption continued to decrease. In the last couple of years, it has continued to increase, which is really, really cool. Okay. And it's not because it's the cheapest option in the grocery store. It's because people want it, they desire it, and they're willing to pay for it. Okay. And so we're seeing this big change in the grade out from an abundance of select beef in 1995 to less than half of that percentage in current years. Okay, 2019, the reported year averages for select cattle was about 18% in the graded categories of prime, choice, and select. choice has become the overwhelming majority, which is awesome to see. And even cooler as a sign is that this last year, we've had over 9% of our cattle base grade prime. Guys, that's exciting. If that doesn't get you excited, I don't know what will. That is so cool. And in fact, currently, there are parts of this country that are grading over 12% USDA prime. Right now, across the board, the national average is right around the 10% mark. That is incredible progress. Congratulations to the cattle producers that are out there that are focusing on what the consumer wants. And I talk about this when I'm sharing with my other species friends. I'm a meat scientist. I'm not just a beef scientist. So I talk to the other species, but I often tell them, guys, you need to look and see what the beef world is doing, what they have done, and considering the long generation intervals, the long time it takes to make big changes in the beef community. This is amazing turnaround, honestly. And I mentioned the 2010 to 2000 or 2009 to 2013 drought that happened in the Central Plains. I showed you the image of the worst week that was happening in 2012. Culled a lot of cattle. It was a tough time. I remember talking to cattle producers then, and they were suffering, especially the guys in Oklahoma, North Texas, Kansas. I mean, it was sad. But when they got back into business, when that free water started falling from the sky again, we started to see quite a bit of rangeland pop back into production. We started seeing that herd rebuilding, and we saw a lot of really high quality cattle coming down the pike, and we're starting to reap the benefits of it right now. So congratulations again to all the cattle producers that are out there. I know I'm excited for it. I'm excited for whatever this adversity has in store for us. There's going to be positive things that come from this. We will see improvements in a lot of different areas, and I hope that continues to be especially in the beef category. People like it, people want it, and I know that the producers are making what the people want. So that's kind of all that I have right now, but I do want to open the last few minutes that we have available for discussion. So Miranda, are there any questions that are out there with our attendees?
No questions so far, but just again want to remind everybody, if you do, please go ahead to feel free and type them into the chat box, and I'll share them with Phil. If you think of questions later, by all means, you can reach out to Phil directly with your questions. Okay.
Yeah, and all of our information. I didn't put a slide with my information out there, but you can get my office number as well as my email address from at the University of Idaho website. I can type it into the chat for folks if you're interested. I can give you my email address. So I'll just do that right now as we're waiting.
Just want to again thank you, Phil, for joining us on our University of Idaho Beef webinar series. At the end of this webinar today, for those that are watching the live offering, there is a short survey, and we'd appreciate the feedback that you could give to us to help us improve these kind of offerings as we move forward in the future, in addition to prepare us for when we all get to start coming back together in person for how we want to approach what educational things that we can share and how best to share them. Want to thank all of you for jumping in with us today. Thank you to those out there later on who are going to watch the recording, and a final thank you to you, Phil.
Absolutely. It's been a pleasure. Thank you. Oh, I see a question, and if it's okay, Miranda, I'll just go ahead and read it and answer it for everyone. Question is, does beef quality translate into ranch profit? And maybe better put, how does quality beef translate into ranch profit? And that's a great question, because that's the end goal, right? We don't want to just do something that's eventually going to that just to do it, right? So yes, ultimately yes, the it does translate into ranch profit. We do, as I showed you earlier, there are premiums that can be gained if you're selling from the feeding phase to the packer directly. But if you say you're talking about you're in the cow-calf, if you're in the cow-calf outfit, or if you're even in the stocker phase, so kind of even in between, does beef quality, does focusing on quality beef and quality genetics and higher cost inputs result in profitability? I firmly believe that it does. I'm not an economist. I don't have that information in front of me. I can't tell you exactly how many dollars you're going to take home. And honestly, any economist that would tell you this is how many dollars you're going to take home because you're focusing on quality, I would say I'd wave the BS flag in the air because it would be almost impossible to fully calculate that. But you have to think of this in any other commodity sense. If you have a quality item, the person buying that from you and they see the value in it, of the either I can take this raw product, being a weaned calf, and I can have it grow well, and now I can sell it to a feeder, or I can sell it to the packer, and the packer identifies this as a quality item that will go back to future sales. And generally you can ask more for that, or people will be more willing to pay for that. I can't give you the exact amount that's out there. I do know there's some economists, Glenn Tonsor out of Kansas State University. They can probably give you a little closer to roundabout numbers that you may be able to gain from that. But you have to just continue to think of this as future sales that are out there. If all we do is produce something that is just pounds and not the quality that's associated with that, it's going to get harder to sell those animals later on. You can still sell them, and you can sell them as a cash item. But if you can sell them more as a premium item, just like anything that's out there, there's generally going to be more value assigned to that. And we have to think of this as in the greater sense. The consumers now identify U.S. beef as higher quality, thankfully, and we need to continue with that pull-through demand. So hopefully that kind of answers the question. I wish I had an exact number that you can get, that I can give you. But there's certain types of cattle that are out there. If you're in the cow-calf business, there's certain types of calves that just will gain more value when you make that sale as a weaned calf or a yearling or whatever. The feed yards know where these animals are coming from as much as we may try to kind of limit that interaction, that trace back to the point of origin. There's the feeders know, and the packers know the feeders, and so we're all kind of intertwined here. And focusing on quality, it's just the best thing for it, and efficiency. If we can get that quality in there and the very efficient animals that we have right now, we're doing a lot of good. So, great question.
Okay, well, if there's no other questions, we're going to go ahead and wrap up for the day. Please don't forget to complete the end of webinar survey, and we'll kind of see you guys down the road when we get ready to do another round of these offerings. Thanks again, Phil.
Thanks, Miranda.